Welcome to episode 81 of the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and I'm here with my co-host, Michael Miller, and today's topic is maps. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Now, Michael, if you could go to map 3242.
3,332.
No, that's 334.
I thought you said 332.
Yeah, no, you're holding 334. Yeah, right there. Okay. That will be a cosmology map of the universe of Gardul.
332, right?
No, 242.
You said 342.
Whatever.
Hang on. It's this one, right?
Yes. See, that's the cosmology of the universe. See, maps don't have to be about the planet and geography. That's what I keep trying to explain to you.
Yeah, but if this is about the stars, shouldn't this be three-dimensional?
No, because it's more of a religious ideology of what the dwarves think the universe looks like. It's a representation of their beliefs of how it works, not the actual cosmology of the universe.
So, it's BS.
Not if you ask a dwarf.
Fair enough.
All right. So
it's a religious map of the stars. It's them interpreting the world around them.
Of the universe. For the dwarfs, the universe is the underground. So as you dig into the ground, you are digging into the universe. You are searching for your god, your gods.
Do they expect to find their god in the dirt somewhere?
Yes.
They expect to dig and find their god.
They actually believe Gardul itself is actually a big cave. And that's what the word Gardul means, is a dwarven word for big cave.
Oh, the dwarves named Gardul.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
I adopted the dwarven name for it, or I sort of made that the dwarven name for it, because I like the idea that you have this culture who thinks the surface is a cave, and stars are actually entrances into other caves. And they're searching for their salvation by digging. And when you dig far enough, you will find the correct cave that is actually the perfect dwarven world.
So do they see that potential as mystical or physical? Like, do they have a concept of, like, if they find this, cave within a cave within the dirt, under the earth, do they understand that they could be looking for a portal to another planet? Like, do they have a concept of planet?
Not when the religion's full. However, as technology and the growth of the understanding of the way the universe works, there's a huge breakdown in dwarven culture around the time that people start figuring out that, oh wait, this is a big round planet in the middle of space, and it's not the inside of a cave.
This sounds vaguely familiar.
Maybe.
Didn't human beings on Earth have something like this happen?
Multiple times, really. I mean, you figure the first people who postulate that we know of the Earth being round were the Greeks, who postulated everything, I guess. And actually, the guy who figured it out was only off by, I believe, a couple thousand miles on the circumference of the planet. However, especially, when it's harder to record stuff in a permanent state and, it's harder to create copies of the material, the information gets lost. And, over time, they were fighting. A lot of people will argue that people thought the Earth was flat during the Middle Ages, which some people probably did believe, and other people probably did not believe.
Well, that was generally agreed upon, though, right? I mean, that's what everybody felt. And
I think people felt it. I think some people did, and some people didn't. I think more educated people, probably even around the time of Columbus, did not think the Earth was flat. Probably poor people who had less education. And when you sit down and look at the universe, it seems to be going around you, so it makes sense that you're just like this flat plane. But I think we actually underestimate people here, because most of the people were involved in the ocean. And most of the people couldn't explain why there wasn't a horizon, because they understand geometry enough to go, if it's flat, I should be able to see something and as far as the eye goes. So something has to cause the horizon, which is what led the Greeks to it. So I think it's a question people went back and forth with a lot, because, I mean, how do you prove that until you go to space?
Yeah.
But once you go to space, it's really ruined for anyone. That conversation is done at that point.
My big reason for bringing up the comparison of Earth to Gardul is that a lot of the creation of a world comes from how are things discovered in the real world. And subsequently, if you are building a fantasy campaign and building a fantasy world at a low tech level, chances are they're going to come across a lot of the same discoveries. You're going to have some of those same revelations, like, oh, this is a spherical, existence, not a flat plane. So,
well, exactly. Or the whole idea of plate tectonics, even. That's something that, I think in the early 1900s was when it was postulated that the Earth was broken up into plates that shifted around. And when they shift, they cause giant mountain ranges like the Himalayas to rise up. And they would be birthed at one part of the plate and be buried at the other end. And some would be growing, some would be shrinking because of the changing nature. And it really goes back to fossils and mountain ranges. And, there's this whole thing of, if you follow the eastern coast of the United States and you get up towards Maine, it looks very similar to the geography in Scandinavia. Obviously the more easy one to tell is look at Africa and South America. Mm-hmm. They look like they're puzzle pieces.
Yeah.
And those two are the easiest to sort of see on the map. But originally, up until like the early 1900s, and probably to like maybe even the 1930s, most people thought they came up with these questions of how come fossils were the same. Very localized fossils that only appeared in two places of the Earth. One would be in Africa, right at that notch where South America were locked in, and then the other plant and very similar life would be on South America. And no one could explain this because they're so far away.
It used to be one.
You would expect to see them in other places and just in very specific locations. And then the old theory, which when you know something different, it sounds crazy, but it was what was believed. It was the scientific consensus of its age, was that there were land bridges that somehow disappeared that connected North America and Europe and Africa and South America together, which could explain why they lived all along that corridor that connected the two, but now that corridor, for whatever reason, is gone. And I don't know what the reason of how that disappeared was, but it was gone. And, but plate tectonics, sort of explained that, and it explained a lot of other things about, how new mountains and new islands form up. Why do new islands keep being formed in the middle of the ocean by nothing at Hawaii? Well, they're being fed by a volcano. And it's all about the thermodynamics underneath the crust, which most fantasy writers probably aren't going to get into. Even though I think it might make for an interesting story at a cataclysm when you have a culture, just think, if, California really falls into the sea, what does that look like? And unfortunately, it's probably going to be really boring because it would happen over a really long period of time. But if you could speed it up, it would be a really good apocalyptic story.
Yes, I was actually about to get to that question because while this is a great, I was going to say geography lesson, but it's not really geography, is it? It's
more about maps.
Yeah, more about planetary development. But how does that spin into advantages to your average world builder?
Okay. Those specific examples, I do see some world builders who actually put together their plate tectonics. I personally have no patience for that because I want my geography fixed because it's tough enough explaining time across the map because maps are like giving you a pie. You see something at the state of which you get it. And, as you eat it, the pie gets smaller.
I love pie.
Pie is delicious. But it explains everything.
The pie does?
The pie does at the moment of the pie. And as you eat the pie, the story of the pie changes. And maps are much the same way as a pie. if you look at a map of the United States today and you go back 100 years, the pie is different. It's a different pie. It's a different story. And so the stories sort of stretch out. You need a series of maps to explain the continuity of time, because that's one thing maps don't natively show in the story that they give you.
Well, because it's a fixed point.
It's a fixed point. And people forget, it's like all of the borders in all of the world have usually some kind of geographical connection to them, a mountain range or river that separates countries. But, if you look at Europe, take 10 different snapshots over the past 4,000 years, it looks completely different every time, because borders are constructions of people. They're just telling you the story at that moment, the political story at that moment. And that's something we often forget, and it's a tough thing to keep track of. And it's an important reason to keep maps and to separate ideas out of geography versus political states. If you make it permanent, it makes your world no longer evolve. And once the world doesn't evolve, if you start telling a story, in the Stone Age about your world, and all of these nation states are exactly the same as they are, in the post-industrial world, your world's going to seem very fake to people over time. And people might not even pick up on it.
I was about to ask. So basically what you're saying is if your world map, if your land masses don't have a time-based evolution, the reader's not going to buy it.
And not so much for the geography, the hard physical geography, but for the cultural geographies. Cultures change over time. Norwegians weren't around 1,000 years ago. There was no Norwegian. They were Norse in Sweden. They were Norse in Norway. They were Norse in Denmark. But growing out of the connection with other cultures around them, the Norwegian culture came forward, the Swedish culture came forward, the Danish culture. England was very much influenced by the Norse as well, too. So the English culture has connection back to the Viking wars that they had and trying to defeat and push the Vikings out. And in a way you think they succeeded, but in a different way they did not, because England was influenced by the Vikings, and the English are probably here because of that war. Before that, they were Anglos, they were Saxons, they were Normans. After all of this stuff happens, you start having people who self-identify as English. So a cultural evolution is always changing, which changes the scape of nations. And if you have a naturalized world, your cultures and nation states are going to evolve over time. So they don't just appear one day as France doesn't just appear on the map one day because of
now there's France.
Now there's France, and there was nothing there before. And
well, I mean, I certainly agree with that. Like, just in general, the history is a slow culturally. I can't even speak that word now. Culturally, that's better when I slow it down. Culturally, you're going to see an evolution of people creating a space for themselves and identifying themselves. Just like, we said, France doesn't just go poof, we're France now. Yes. It's a slow evolution. But while that works for history, and if you're going to create a story that has that big of a history, fine, you're gonna do that.
Yes.
But if I'm following a story series, even if it covers, hundreds of years, because it's a fiction, I don't know that I would even pick up on that.
And you might not. But once again, that goes to the story of who's your avatar. And if their avatar is someone who doesn't pick it up, then it's fine. But for someone like me reading it, I'm like, wait, how come you've had massive changes in religion? You've had massive turmoil and epic stories happening in the past 42 books of this series. How come nothing else has changed? The cultures haven't been changed after the invasion of the massive steppe hordes. That changes a culture forever. When you get under a massive threat from this imminent danger, when the Mongols came to Europe, Europe was never going to be the same. It changed Europe forever. It changed every culture who felt threatened by the massive hordes of Kublai Khan.
I think an important thing to get out of this conversation is that if you're going to create a persistent world, that you should do some reading on history. Like, I mean, you're much more learned on history than I am.
Yeah.
My history knowledge is very low. But I don't think I would even, like I said, I don't think I would have picked up on that as a necessity for creating a story.
And that really comes down to also is one, it might not need to. Once again, it's the audience you're talking to. It's your preference as the artist who's creating the world, who wants to share the stories on whether or not that's important, because you create more work for yourself.
Right. I mean, it's an architect idea.
Yeah,
it's definitely an architect idea.
Most definitely. And if I was a gunslinger, I might still do it, but it would be in a different way where, oh wait, now this is happening. Let me write down a few things that I want to happen to this culture over this book because of the invasion.
Right.
And so that way in the next book, they've grown and I know how they're different now than they were 2 books before.
So we're covering a lot of culture and a lot of as time passes and a planet changes. So when you start thinking, when you first started creating Gardul and thinking about it as a physical space, did you start with a map? Did you start with drawing it out and then decide how the cultures were going to get laid out? And these are my mountain ranges are here, so this is where my mountain people are going to be. These are my, what was the process?
So, once again, it evolved. This word I always go back to, but the first time I drew it out, I wanted a geography just for a geography. And I sort of drew it out on a piece of paper. And the problem was, because of the way my brain works wasn't caught up with what I was doing, I didn't think it through well. Essentially, then it's like, wait, this shouldn't be the same anymore, but now I have this one pen and paper map. And so now let me try and trace it as close as I can to the previous one to see what it's like now as things change. And I kind of realized, early on that, and there's actually a good image of, my second generation of Gardul.
On the website.
On the website.
I was going to ask you, how accurate is that? That's an accurate representation?
That's a pretty accurate representation, because when I made that one, I learned from my mistake the first time that when you have this, in geomapping you call it base maps, you have these sort of base maps, and geography is one of those things. And yes, it's not in the show notes at all. We've not really touched the show notes at all yet. But it is this idea that certain things don't change much, but the story does. And you can use maps to tell your story. So when I created the next one, I literally drew out one on the classic large square, small square grid paper, because I always like that kind better because I like the smaller squares.
Just the graph paper?
Yeah. But it's like you have some graph paper where all the squares are the same size. And then you have the graph paper that has sort of bolder lines, but there are less of those squares. And then there's smaller squares within each of those. I like that. So I hand drew it on that. But after I got the basic geography down, which the idea was, what kind of land masses do I need to have the conditions to create cultures I want? And that was kind of the idea. I like the whole idea of steps.
So you had ideas for cultures first and built the world based on the cultures you wanted, as opposed to creating a physical world and then deciding what would be appropriate to live there.
Yes.
Okay.
And if you don't have cultural goals, a cleaner way of doing it would be to do the geography first. If you have ideas of certain things that you want to cover and you want it to seem naturalized, like there are certain conditions that cause certain things to happen, you kind of have to think about the geography a bit more.
Well, give me an example of what you mean by that.
For example, the idea of Britain. So like the idea of Britain. Britain has a much different mindset than the rest of Europe. And a lot of times you hear them talk about this where it's the continental Europe versus Britain. And sometimes the ideas are different. A lot of things are different. They drive backwards on the roads compared to the rest of Europe. For a long time, not as long as the U.S., they held on to feet and inches instead of moving to the metric system. There were some serious differences, even though geographically they're not very far apart, but it was because they were disconnected by water. And when you become disconnected by water, you can focus on things like the British did, like building a navy. And the navy becomes your first line of defense on your country, but as your navy grows more powerful, it then gives you this huge power base to grow out and grow empire across the world because you have the navy to get there. you have the Navy to control the currents to get there. And so the story of something like Britain was about this powerful Navy, and he used the Navy to expand your influence across the world, where in places like Germany or France, and Spain even, it was always much more focused on armies on the land because you had physical borders you had to protect versus your neighbor. And so if you want something to have sort of that sense of isolation, and the U.S. is the same way too. We have the Atlantic and Pacific that keeps us away from most of the industrialized world. At least the parts with armies, we're separated by ocean. We're next door to Canada, we're next door to Mexico, but they've not developed and focused so much on the military as certain other countries have. So it allows you to think differently. The U.S. came up with air forces. And the U.S. is much like this too, where as the world wars are developing, you have Britain with a large navy, and the U.S. had a pretty large navy at the time too. So did Japan, who was also somewhat isolated, on an island much like Britain. But the U.S. also, because of the technology of the time, started focusing very heavily on air power. And that's where you have these massive fleets of bombers from the United States that had very long range because they needed it. German bombers did not have the range to hit us, even though they had definitely the technology to build them. Mm-hmm. They were always focused on different types of bombers because of the situation of their connection to the rest of Europe in the war.
They're more, I assume, more short range sort of stuff?
Short and medium range bombers that, just had, you didn't want to store all the fuel because you store more bombs. So, same size aircraft with less fuel, more bombs. We seem to manage quite a few bombs in ours, but geography can tell you those kind of things. The more isolated someone is, it's like Indian tribes left alone in the Amazon, could still be relatively the exact same way they were 2,000 years ago with very little change if they don't have a lot of influence with other people. Mm-hmm. But obviously the Indian tribes, were closer to the coast, or obviously the Indian tribes in North or Central America are nowhere where they were because of the influence of Europe coming here. So, but really what it comes down to is, one, the desire of depth you want to go into as a world builder, and knowing what your needs are. When you have your needs identified, which is why you need the maps, is this going to be a map for a video game? Is this going to be a map for the front cover of a book? Is this going to be a map that you use to reference yourself? It gives you a lot of flexibility of what you can do. And once you know what you need it for, then you can actually come up with possible solutions of ways to map it. For pen and paper is great. Obviously, it's hard to get it into a published format. It's hard to go from pen and paper directly into, you can't just upload your paper map into a scanner and have it turn into Skyrim.
Right.
Which would be really, really cool. If someone could develop that software and send it to me, I want it.
What do you mean you want software where you could draw something and then have it be a part of your Skyrim world?
Just to here's the world, here's your world in Skyrim, and now you can customize it all. Just like a really easy plug-in to completely erase their world.
I'm 100% sure there are video game creation tools that.
Yes, but you have to have skills to make things in those.
Well, no, there's actually some stuff coming out that's I wish I could remember the name of it. It was just at 2015 K3, which was only a few weeks ago or a week ago. And there was some big tool and.
Well, I think, and there are some tools out there that make this stuff easier. And there are also, and those things will be getting better and better. Who knows what?
But even still, it's an involved task.
It's an involved task.
It's an involved task no matter how simple you make it, it's still.
I mean, I literally want to scan a map and be able to play my world with my colors and stuff.
I don't think you're going to see that anytime soon.
Probably no time soon, yes. Okay. But, so a lot of things you can do too is, you start off with research. I'm a big book guy. I'm a big documentary guy. Amazon is a classic place I go to for Amazon Prime. I get a lot of documentaries to them I can watch for free. Plus, when I buy books, they're shipped to me cheaper. Mm-hmm. And for all those people out there, and so we don't get the producers stepping in so quickly here, you can actually go right to garduel.com/Amazon. It will redirect you immediately to Amazon's webpage, and they will give us a kickback on anything that you purchase, and it will cost you no more money. It's a wonderful way to help support the show.
And getting back to resources, if they're heading to Amazon, what kind of mapping resources could they get at Amazon? Anything that you have recommendations on?
Well, there's two classic pieces of software that I know of, and there are more than this, but just the ones I know that people use. One of which is Photoshop, which if you don't get the cloud version, I'm sure you could buy a version of Photoshop through Amazon. To me, and I've seen some really good, it's Photoshop, so some of the maps I've seen today are just absolutely gorgeous. And I know people who use Amazon specifically, and who use Photoshop specifically to make maps, and they're terrific. One of the people I interviewed, Dean Frost, makes maps in Photoshop, and that's beyond my skill set, but which is why I use Campaign Calligrapher, which is a CAD program. Are you familiar with CAD programs?
I'm familiar with, yes, a little bit. It's not something that I haven't used AutoCAD since probably sophomore year of high school. So
yeah, but it's that idea, but it's geography CAD, so you can actually create coastlines. You can then what they call fractalize a coastline, because when you see a map from a distance, it looks like there's kind of like a straightish coast. But as you get closer and closer, it gets more and more messed up. Of course. So there's like tools that, will do a lot of that kind of work for you. You just click on the coastline and say, keep messing it up.
Screwing it up.
And then and it creates it all in a vector image, so you can look at it or zoom into it, and there's very little lost, data. That's what I prefer to use, because I can make maps. And if you've seen like the current generation of Gargoyle maps, it doesn't look that far. 17.
Okay, this one.
Yeah. It's like, it looks like something you're much more likely to see on your phone as you zoom into it. Most of the mountains are actually pictures, so those might not look quite right in all of the areas of the world yet, but from a backed out scale, and even in it looks more like a geography of a world. And a very texture rich program, but there's a low learning curve, and there are a few tips. And what I'm probably going to do is put together some YouTube videos showing how I use it, and the lessons I've learned, just to make it easier for people, because that's useful.
How you've used
Campaign Calligrapher to create maps.
Campaign Calligrapher. Okay.
And I don't.
Put a note in the show notes.
Well, there will be a note in the show notes. Thank you, producer.
So you're talking Campaign Calligrapher.
Campaign Calligrapher. And they have a lot of pre-built symbols that you can use, and you can actually buy sets of new symbols to bring in. And
for a map key?
For to show things on the map. So they have symbols for mountain ranges. And it's kind of nice too, because like if you're doing mountain ranges, they have like multiple symbols. So like all your mountains don't look the same, but there's actually a tool to where you can actually click it and it will randomly choose a mountain for you. Mm-hmm. So you can get all relatively same size mountains, and it will randomly move them. So as you put them on the map, it adds a bit more variation. So it's not just like an old standard D&D map where all of the mountains are the exact same symbol, to show that there's
like
a mountain.
Just a triangle. Here's a mountain. Is this, does it come out as just a 2-dimensional looking map, or does it create like a 3-dimensional looking?
It's 3-dimensional looking, but it's a 2D map. There is another tool by the same company called Fractal Train, and I believe it's on the 3rd version of that now. And the Fractal Train Designer will actually generate a world for you.
Really?
To the point where you can start with nothing in 2 seconds, have a world. And it will tell you the precipitation levels of areas.
See, that's cool.
It will get very detailed depth into the ocean, very, very quickly. And you can actually export that or parts of that into the Campaign Calligrapher to actually add in like your city symbols and stuff like that. Fractal Terrain is a little bit cooler if you want to naturalize the world but don't want to think much about it, because they have tools to where you can paint climate. So you want an area drier and you can sort of paint it, and it will actually affect the entire world. The same way as if you dry out North America today, it's going to have influence on the world around it as well too. So there's a ripple effect when you make a decision. you can decide I want more islands here, so let me start raising the elevation, and you'll start to see islands start to sprout out of the ocean. And you can start from either a flat map and paint it yourself, which, to be honest, I tried it that way and I didn't really like it.
Why? Too involved, or
it's just too slow? I just didn't enjoy it. To me, the better thing is they have different random generators for how it develops the geography. So you kind of find one that's along the lines of what you're looking for, and you can either randomly generate a few until you get something that looks kind of the way you want.
Yeah.
And then you can actually take that.
And can you manipulate it at that point?
You can manipulate it and change it. And because obviously if you don't, it has, I think, about 4 billion presets really, because it's a random generator. Mm-hmm. So it's really based off of a number. If you change the number and put it through the same formula, it will generate a completely different looking world.
See, that sounds like a great way to go. If you're more interested in creating a story, not necessarily creating,
or if you don't care about geography, but you want something natural, but you don't want to do it, it's a great piece of software. And I believe you can export it in many different formats, and some of them might be connected actually to like video game engines, and I'm not sure. And you have to do research if you're making video games, but I believe, because this is actually a 3D globe that you're making, you can make a flat world there too if you want to. But you can actually, most of the settings are actually meant to be a 3D globe. And so when you take it and project it out onto a map, it's actually going to look different than what you see it, where
because they have something that flattens it out for you.
Yeah, so it's flattened out when you look at it, but it's different in the globe, much like the Earth.
Yeah.
Now you look at the Earth, you go, Greenland is as big as Australia. How come it's not a continent? And you learn that, wait a second, it's because I'm looking at it flat. And when you look at it flat, to make it look kind of correct, it looks the same size, but it's really much smaller than Australia. But it's just the way the projection gets, the closer you get to a pole, the larger things are going to look. But in reality, they're actually much smaller when you get to the pole than what it shows. And that's just geography or geometry kind of stuff there. But,
there was a great thing that I watched on, if somebody had posted a link to it, or if I just happened to catch it on YouTube or whatever. It was talking about how maps are modern maps are very inaccurate size-wise. Mm-hmm. And they were basically talking about the cultural impact that our maps have on cultures throughout the world. So you look at your average two-dimensional map, and the United States looks pretty big, even though it's really not. Mm-hmm. Like, most of the maps show the United States as almost the largest landmass. I mean, of course, Africa's bigger. Of course, the entirety of Asia is bigger. But that, this whole presentation was done all about mapping. And they said, this is what we would like our maps to look like. We're trying to push this out as the new standard. And they showed this map, and it didn't even look like the Earth as we know it when you look at a map. What they had done is flipped everything upside down. Upside down as the orientation of what we're normally accustomed to. Australia was on the upper left-hand side of the map as opposed to the lower right. And they're like, well, why'd you do that? And they're like, why not? Yeah. The world is a 3D thing. We're the ones that create up and down. So it doesn't have to be that way. They're like, so turn it around. And everything was done to a more appropriate scale. And you get the sense of, there's a lot of countries and spaces on the planet that are dramatically misrepresented in our maps. And subsequently people create a mindset based on how they identify with their country in conjunction with how it appears to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's pretty, kind of out there of a thought, but there's a whole bunch of people out there that are really committed to trying to change the way our maps look because of how it affects people's point of view.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the whole idea of why we're the West. And where's the starting point of
that? It's only because we were over there first.
Exactly.
If we were here first, then it wouldn't be the West.
It wouldn't be the West, it would be here.
Yeah. In the Western world. Why is the Western world, if they'd have went east, it'd be the Eastern world?
Or the time zones, run through Greenwich. Mm-hmm. And I think they changed the names of stuff now, so it's no longer the Greenwich Mean Line, or I think that's what it's called. That is Zero Zulu now is what they call it, I think. But that might be an army thing. Universal time is, I think, what they call it now.
I actually deal a lot with that at work. because of all our software. We have like 3 different sets of time zones that we track. And within those, our devices, depending on their geographic location, might be set to not only set to whatever their time zone is, but they might actually be using a different, like universal time code. So.
Well, one of the other interesting things too, along with maps to keep in mind, is cultures determine the relative importance of directions. And, it's actually a relatively new thing where north is up on a map. Up on a map used to be, I believe, to Jerusalem. I could be wrong with that, but Jerusalem would be at the middle of the map, or depending on the scale of the map, the idea would be if the map was larger, Jerusalem would have to be at the middle. Everything was orientated out towards Jerusalem, and this is like in medieval Christian Europe.
I can't imagine how convenient that would be. It's like you're exploring something that's really far from Jerusalem. Well, it has to be in the middle, so the map's like 5 by 5 feet.
That's right.
Roll that thing up and put it on the horse.
A map of France, and Jerusalem's right in the middle. Wait, it has to be there.
So we have to include 4,000 miles of more space on the other side of the map because Jerusalem has to be in the middle of it.
But this is actually a good cultural tip, too, because the thing to realize is the way your map is orientated, if you create a map for a culture, what direction is important to them? And there will be a reason why, and it will be inbred into the culture from before they become a culture, really, of why this direction is important. And they can change over time.
I would think that I would have to think that the first focus would be survival, so food. Food and water.
So food and water, or
like where are we going to get our food and water so we can live till tomorrow, and subsequently that snowballs how the cultural establishment.
Do you remember where Lower and Upper Egypt were?
No.
And I probably have it backwards here because it shows how different it is from our cultural perception. But Upper Egypt was towards the source of the Nile, not towards the Mediterranean. And so when you look at a modern map and you sit there and go, well, here's the Mediterranean. Why would Upper Egypt be below Lower Egypt? Well, it wasn't to the Egyptians.
Right, because they weren't looking at it
because the source was south, not north.
Yeah.
And so that's a very key thing to think about is, to them, south is probably more holy, because that's the source of life to them. That's the important stuff is south of us, not where we are. And most cultures, where you're at is probably not the most important place. Whether it's physically able to get there or not, which usually not, but where you're at is usually not where you want your destination to be, unless you're Sumerian, in which you don't want to go to the afterlife. If you're a Sumerian, do not go to the afterlife. It's better to die and turn to dust than go to Sumerian heaven, because hell would seem better.
You're taking us to a dark place. I'm afraid to ask what Sumerian afterlife is like.
Well, I mean, hell is largely based on the ideas. Our notions of hell come from the ideas of their afterlife. But the thing was, you could, I believe, and I could have this wrong, you didn't have to go to the afterlife. Not everyone went to the afterlife, and you were shooting not to go to the afterlife, because if you did, it was only hell.
So oblivion is preferred or expected, or a goal,
And I don't know
what would. Not knowing anything about Sumerian culture, what would be something that would you'd avoid? Like, I guess sins. Like what would cause you to go to hell as opposed to just oblivion?
Yeah, and I don't know enough about, and I don't think we archaeologically know enough about, because this is pre-Babylonia. So I don't think we know enough about their culture to know that.
Or at least you and I in this conversation.
You and I
certainly don't know enough about
Yes, we don't. And I don't think archaeologists know enough, because it's under so many layers of civilizations that have come since then. So I don't think, it's one of the cultures we don't know a lot about, but I would assume just generically their kings were really high priests. They were the head of the religion. And which was very common for a long time in the Middle East. And so, I think it would probably be service to the religion, which is service to the state, which is...
I was going to say, so no separation between church and state, obviously, for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think some people would probably argue that the states rose up because of religious consensus. The original states in that area of the world first started showing up when you could get enough people to go, yeah, Asher is our god. So we're going to follow Asher. And if you don't follow Asher, we're going to attack. And we're going to expand our kingdom, our religion, our language with it. Mm. And that's sort of where you go from nothing to city-states to the Babylonian Empire.
And thus cultures influencing mapping and geography.
Exactly. There's some other types of software you can use too. One I want to cover is GIMP. Are you familiar with GIMP?
Probably not in the context you're referring to.
Yeah, you're thinking of a movie. I can tell from your eyes and the nervous look on your face.
Not thinking.
Bring out the GIMP, Kristen.
I just didn't know if somebody had video of my private life.
No, there's a piece of software that is a free and open source. People will call it a free and open source version of Photoshop, which isn't quite true. But for electronic media, if that's what you're looking for, images to share on the internet, you can do anything in here that you can do in Photoshop.
Well, that's convenient because, as far as I'm aware, Photoshop's not an inexpensive program. So.
It is a super expensive program, and a lot of times to make some of these tasks easier, you have to purchase plugins as well. If you want to fractalize your terrain without having to do it by hand, you can buy software that I think that you can mimic sort of the behavior of Campaign Calligrapher. And there was not a Campaign Calligrapher. I think it was like $50.
Yeah.
Where Photoshop, I believe by itself is, I think, $600.
I was going to say, last I looked at it, it was like $5.
And you can do it different now too. Like if you get Photoshop, the cloud version, I think you can pay for just that, and you get it for the length of time you need it for, and you can maybe do it in Photoshop for cheaper that way. But
the point is that GIMP is a free option.
GIMP is a free option, and
it's GIMP.
GIMP.
Okay. It's in the show notes.
The link is in the show notes. Yes, it is. Thank you, producer. Enjoy your Dunkin' Donuts over there. Oh, I'm sorry, your Dunkin'.
America runs on Dunkin'.
Yes, it does. But okay, another option, and I think this is one to really keep in mind if you want to give out copies of your map, and you're not a cartographer.
Wait. So people listening to this show might not be. I thought it was all cartographers.
The ability to make maps and the ability to make professional maps that you want people to feel like they weren't ripped off by buying are two different things. So it's like my maps, I think maybe could be pulled off, but there are people who can really they can add styles to it and take it to whole different levels that you might not be able to. Or maybe you don't want to spend the time to. But there are people who create fantasy maps. You give them money and you get maps. And, my friend Dean Frost, a good fantasy novelist, a very good fantasy novelist, she does this, and there are other people out there who get paid by other world builders to make the maps for them, because some people don't care about the geography as much. And even if they do, especially like if you're doing it in Photoshop, there's a bigger learning curve to getting good looking maps. I think it's a little bit easier, but it might not fit the scenario that you might not want such an electronic looking map. If you want to have this ancient map, that is sort of supposed to feel like it's from the story.
Yeah, something that looks like it came on a scroll, something.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where cartographers and graphic design people who specialize in cartography, those are the people you go to in those scenarios. And it's probably only a scenario like it's going into a book, or it's like a fold-up thing that goes into a box that you get with your video game.
Right.
And because you pre-ordered it 74 years before it came out, which if it was good enough came out right.
Yeah, well, I know if you pre-order Fallout 4, it comes with a pit bullet. So
really,
I think I get like a collection edition.
I hadn't known. There's also a very neat website which will be in the show notes. The producer smiled. Called Donjon, and not our friends Don and John, but it's a website DONJON, and they have a lot of generators on it for free.
Like map generators.
Map generators or fractal generators, which the difference being the fractal is the sort of round globe looking thing, and the other one is a flat map. And it's just the way, it's a difference in the way they're designed. And that has a lot. They actually have a lot of other neat sort of generators. If you're a role playing person, exactly. This site is made for you. And there's a lot of stuff specific to role-playing games on the site as well, too.
I was actually just about to ask that. Like, how many times has it been like, okay, give me a piece of paper. And then the GM and everyone crowds around the GM for a second while he hand draws something on notebook paper. Okay, this is what the room looks like. There's a rock here, there's stuff here, and the monster's coming from this side.
You'll be shocked to learn that in some of my games where fog of war was important and I had people doing activities, I would be drawing a map for them as they're progressing.
So for those of you that are not familiar, if you're not a gamer, you might not be familiar with the term fog of war. That basically means you're only showing the players as far as their character would physically be able to see, thus not granting them the ability to metagame and take advantage of an area of the map that they can see as a player, but wouldn't be able to take advantage of as a character because they wouldn't be able to see it.
Yeah, that pretty much covers it. And you'd be even more shocked to know that generally when I do that, I have no idea what it looks like before I start.
It's a cavern. You're quickly trying to come up with what a cavern looks like.
That's right. There's things hanging from the ceiling and bat poop on the floor.
So say that website again.
It is Donjon, DONJON, and it will be a link to it in the show notes as well too. And there's a lot of neat. There's like generate an elf name, generate a dwarf name. So especially for like if you're a game master, there are more tools than
a lot of resources there.
Yeah. Now, one other one I'd like to cover. There's a good list I found on Virtual RPG Tabletop of different types of mapping solutions.
What do you mean solutions?
Different pieces of software to allow you to map.
Okay.
And to create maps for whatever reason you're going to, but BS maps. And there will be a link to that in the show notes as well too. Another link that's going to be in the show notes will be to the Cartographers Guild. And it's a good place. If you want to learn more about the map making process, you can actually go to the site. And it's a bunch of people who are cartographers, amateur and professional, I would assume, who discuss how to do things. They probably cover different kinds of software and different ways to make the maps look better. So if you're a real map geek like me, the forum at thecartographersguild.com is probably a good place to go check out as well. But I really think that's all we have for maps today. I guess I'm going to do the rating now because I wasn't following my outline very good. The rating for this episode is either basic, and that is your basic pen and paper, sketched out real quick, all the way to completely nutso insane, which might be required depending on the project you're working on. If you're creating the next version of Elder Scrolls, you're going to need one heck of an impressive looking map.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing that you said real early on in the episode is identify your need first.
Yeah.
If you don't need to, build a 3-dimensional world to tell a story, then don't. But as Jeff mentioned in, I think, the last episode, he's an architect world builder, so he likes to have a lot of detail. I would think that I definitely fall in the gardener idea. So for me, I wouldn't go to the trouble of getting into like tectonic shifting, and I would probably have a general idea of what my world is like just for the purposes of how I need to tell my story, and if I need to jump 500 years in the future, then I would probably just create, I'd probably just make up the differences over that time. But that's how I would go about it.
Yeah.
So identify your need, and that's going to determine how you're going to go about your mapping.
Yes, and being some level of a gardener at times you need to be, because if you're an architect strictly, your world will never be done, because the thing to remember is, let's just guess, and I'm making up a number, and this is not right, but let's say this has all been happening for 1 billion years. And I know it's more than that, or we believe it's more than that, but some people believe it's less than that, but most people think it's probably more than 1 billion years old. But we'll say strictly 1 billion years old.
You're talking existence.
Yeah.
Okay.
All of the things that happen from the beginning to the end have happened over 1 billion years. So for one person to get everything in 1 billion years to happen in the length of a planet on to paper before they start writing stories is impossible. From it, even if you're not being naturalized, you really just kind of BSing your way through. You can't do an entire world in which billions of people have lived and have done things and get it all down on paper. It's like, one of my friends, we'll call him Mr. Six.
Hey, Six.
Yes. We were joking around. We were talking about Koji, a vampire game. And we were going off into an area where there were no source books for. Because he's kind of like me where, okay, it's great you have the source world, but we hate that people buy those books and read them.
What? And we have friends that write those books.
Oh, no, I own those books.
I know, but what do you mean, like...
The players.
Oh, like the players memorize the source book and thus use that to metagame within the game you're running.
Which would be a huge mistake if you ever play a game. Do that, even if the source does exist, because trust me, it won't be the same. You might think it is for a few minutes, and that will probably be me handing you over.
Yeah. And you know, just if you're listening to this as a role player, be a good role player. Mm-hmm. Like it bugs. We have, and I won't name names, but we have had a couple of people at the table over the years that they just get into arguing with the GM or other players and they just get mired in the numbers.
Yeah.
And it's not about that. That's not fun.
Yeah.
Like, stop getting caught up in the system or the source book or the map. If the GM says it's a different way, it's a different way. Mm-hmm. All that stuff are just guidelines. So
if you don't like it, don't play with the GM.
Yeah. You know, there were things that you allowed me to do in our campaign, the drama players that, by the numbers couldn't have been done. Mm-hmm. Like you granted me a few very significant graces, mm-hmm. but not for the purposes of me to overpower a character so that we could create some cool moments.
Yasad could not be overpowered.
Yeah.
It was a character that could not possibly be overpowered.
Well, yes, but you granted him things temporarily mm-hmm. that there's no rightful way he should have been able to pull off, but it was only for the purpose of dramatic effect, and I never abused it.
No.
And that's why...
And that's why I granted you
the power. That's why you granted me that. And that's the point.
It made it for a more enjoyable story for not only you, but the other people around the table.
Exactly. And if anything, it actually worked against my character in the long run for the point why, like, he suffered greatly because of it, but I was more than willing to take that on because I was more committed to the story than the character.
Yes. And for anyone who is thinking about ever playing with me, because I'll probably at some point start doing Roll20 games.
What do you mean Roll20 games?
It's a website called Roll20 that you can actually import your maps into, and you can say what system you're using, and you can actually have characters, and it's like a Google Hangout kind of.
Okay.
But it's at the backdrop of an actual tabletop game.
Okay.
So it's kind of neat. And when I get time, I'm going to.
I don't know with all your architectural building.
Yeah, book and editing, and it's.
I mean, all these freaking maps. Where do you even have the time? There's like 1,400 maps right here. There's another 3,500 on the drawing board in the other room.
Yeah, but all those aren't finished. But you need those maps.
No, you need those maps. And more importantly, not everyone needs all those maps.
Really?
Look, I've got stories. I don't have any maps.
Fascinating. Well, okay, Mr. Debbie Downer.
Why am I always the downer on the show? I don't understand how you think that I'm the downer on the show.
Because you just said you have no maps, and we're in an episode about maps. That's kind of a downer.
Fair enough. So you covered the rating. What about the tasks for the day?
Well, okay. The world building task of the day is create a new map for your world. And now this could be a map of your continent if you don't have one, if you've been too lazy like Mike. Or it could be, it doesn't even have to be about geography. It could be about the solar system. It could be a mind map trying to explain a culture before you start writing it down to help you map out how the culture works. It could be any form of map that helps make your world a little better for you in producing your stories.
You know what? I'm not going to get into it because we've already been going for a while already, but we did not even touch on other definitions of mapping, like story mapping and outlining. So we should definitely have that for another show. But I just want to acknowledge that concept of mapping out your stories. It's just basically another usage of the word mapping, but that should be acknowledged.
Yes, we will definitely be covering story mapping in a later episode, I think. Yes.
Real world task for the day.
The real world task for the day is seek motivation for going. And I was actually talking to Mike before this started. Michael. You missed the Michael earlier.
Sometimes I let him go.
But I was actually at a conference this last weekend, and I had a New York Times bestseller right down in my wife's notebook that I was looking forward to seeing my book. That's finding motivation. And you don't know where you'll find it, and that was not something asked for. There's nothing that adds stress to really motivate me, but you have to find those motivations, those things that keep you moving forward to creating what you're going for, because there's always going to be excuses. And from writers and other creative people who are afraid of sharing, excuses are your best friend, and they give you an excuse not to do the thing that you want to do but are afraid to do. So look for some motivation going forward. And I would suggest, and there will be a link to this in the show notes, read Start by John Acuff. This is the book that initially got me willing to even consider the possibility of sharing stories or hosting a podcast. So if you're sitting there and you're on the fence going, I wish I could do something with this in my life because I love doing it, but I have no time because I'm at work and I just don't know what to do. Start won't find the thing for you, but it will help give you motivation to start, like the title says.
Yeah.
So I guess that does kind of explain that.
Something I really wanted to add to this. I've been listening to the old episodes of World Builders Anvil. I know it seems strange that there were episodes without me, but I've been listening to the older episodes, and I was going through all the interview episodes. I believe every single person you've interviewed, and they've all been creators, authors, artists, and in the gauntlet round, you asked them a bunch of questions, and one of the questions you asked them, which I think is a brilliant question, I never would have thought to ask this, what was the one thing that prevented you from starting or creating your world or your fiction or whatever it is that you're working on? And mind you, he hits them with these questions very quickly, so they have to just answer quickly the first thing that comes to the top of their head. And almost all of them said the exact same thing. They all said, I was afraid that my stuff wasn't good enough. Mm-hmm. So here I am talking to you, the listener. Your stuff is good enough. What you have to contribute is good enough. Other people want to read it. They want to see it. They want to experience it. So do it. Like just put it to paper. Put it to, the screen. Share it with others. What you have in mind is original and it's great, and we want to see it.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. And that's the whole thing. And that's the reason I asked that question was because of Start and a few other people we listened to. My wife and I, we listened to, they're always talking about, what was your now moment or the thing that let you know how to go forward. And the reason I asked that question is part of me was curious to wonder how often, because that was obviously my biggest stumbling block. And like I said, and I don't think it's exclusively, but pretty close, fear.
Yeah.
And it's either I can't find an audience or no one will like what I'm doing.
Do it anyway.
Yeah. Do it anyway.
Even if you think no one's going to like it, do it anyway. Do you like it? Do you want to do it? Do it.
And you might not, we can't promise an audience, but there are people out there. And part of the job as the author too, or the creator who creates new software or anything, is part of it is to create it, and the other part is to find your audience, because they are out there.
Yeah. And in today's day and age, it's much easier to find those audiences than it was previously.
Oh, most definitely. The tease for the next episode, which is written wrong on these show notes. You did a horrible job putting this together.
Well, I fired my secretary this week.
Very good. Is how can presidential politics inspire better world building? Ooh. Yuck. And as always, make sure to go to Gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike while the myth rolls high.